In my mid-20s, I started competing in triathlon, and small confession, I have an addictive personality, and I'm also a number 3 on something called the Enneagram. Like 4 people are like, yeah. Side note, we're going to be doing an Enneagram event in the fall. You should definitely do it if you like to be self-aware and sort of, it hurts a little bit. It hurts good. So I'm addictive. I'm a 3 on the Enneagram. The point is, triathlon was a fairly rapid progression for me. I did a few sprint triathlons. Those are the shorter ones. And then I was like, oh, I can double that distance. It's called an Olympic triathlon or international. I did that for a couple seasons. And then I felt like I would need more coaching and instruction if I was going to pull off a half Ironman, which is double the Olympic, which is double the sprint. And so I bought a book and I found a training group. I did that. And then right after I did my first half Ironman, my training partner was like, well, you're already in pretty good shape, so you might as well go ahead and do the full Ironman. And I was like, okay, yeah. As you can imagine, the one-up culture in competitive triathlon is ridiculous. Whether you're training or you're racing, everyone is trying to outdo each other. Everyone's done more, everyone's suffered more, they've all done. So it's like, oh, you did a sprint? Well, I did an Olympic. Well, you did an Olympic? Well, I did a half Ironman. Well, you did a half Ironman? I did a full Ironman. And I thought, for a minute, this was stupid, that when I finished my first full Ironman, I thought I had walked on the moon. That was sort of the period, the end of the social fantasy one-upper. I am an Ironman. Or like if you've talked to Caitlin at all, conversations with her about hiking, right? She can always go, well, I've hiked the Appalachian Trail. And everybody has to like shut up. They're like, okay, yeah, I haven't done that. I haven't walked anywhere for 6 months, so you win. But what I learned is that there's such a thing as an iron distance event. So the one I did was in Claremont. It was called the Great Floridian, which is the same exact 140.6 miles, but it is not an Ironman branded sanctioned event, or an MDOT. You can sort of see the M with the head on top. That's called an MDOT. This is the official Ironman thing. So I'd be like, oh, I did an Ironman. And they'd be like, well, that wasn't a real Ironman. And to be fair, the one thing that I did miss, the voice of Ironman is a guy named Mike Riley, right? And he has this very like iconic voice. When you cross the line, he goes, Ben Collins, you are an Ironman. And so I didn't get that, right? So I missed that part. But I had gone, right, in the course of a number of seasons, I had gone from a 15-mile, 1-hour race to 140.6 all-day race, and I was still being one-upped. And then to my horror, I found out there was such a thing as an Ultraman, which is double all of the distances of the Ironman. And so all I have to say tonight is Ironman, Ultraman, one-uppers, I can't compete. I'm done. You win. You have the floor. How many of you stuck around long enough last week to see the beginning of the flood that took our building out? Yeah, a handful of us. Matt's car got killed, essentially. We had this epic flood, and the lounge was flooded. We took a wave in through the front door. A pizza delivery guy came by and sent a wave through the front door. And it got me thinking about when I was like in high school, we'd have these hurricanes and our neighborhoods would flood. And me and my high school friends would do this sort of one-upper me monster thing with flood stories, right? And so we'd be like, dude, we had knee-high water in our street. Well, dude, we were bodyboarding down the grass hill in our front yard. Well, dude, we had water up our fence in the backyard and swarms of angry fire ants who were swimming and attacking our house. And dude, we live on a canal and alligators were coming up through the backyard. And dude, we went wakeboarding behind my friend's 4x4 truck in the middle of our neighborhood, which we actually did. It was pretty epic. Even writing the sermon, this is funny. We sort of had our like little group think tank. Caitlin and I were telling me monster one-upper stories. And at one point, I think we realized I was getting one-upper storied over my one-upper stories, right? Her one-upper stories were better than my one-upper stories. Like you think you've heard one-upper stories. You think you've got me monster stories. I've got even better me monster stories. Like we can't get away from this. What is this? So me monsteritis, or what we might call pride or vainglory, this is sort of a macro theme throughout the entirety of the Bible. In this passage, the prophet Isaiah is speaking to, or about at least, the king of Babylon, accusing the king of exalting himself above God. I'm amazing, I'm great, I'm the best, I'm divine. This may sound familiar. Rising himself above the status of God. We see this occur with Babylon. We see it occur with Assyria. It occurs with the Greeks in the books of Daniel, especially in the books of Revelation. Kings become these sort of ultimate me monsters who declare themselves gods, or above the gods even. And it raises this question, what is this? Why do we do this? Why do these individuals do this? You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly, the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. This is what's called an ascending spirituality or a theology of ascent. These people begin as people, mere mortals, and they are elevated, quote unquote. Really what we mean is they declare themselves divine once they have an army and an empire to back it up. Because then you go, wait a minute, you're not God. And they're like, okay, tell that to my army. So they sort of decide they're gods once you can't tell them otherwise. Isaiah uses this phrase, son of the dawn, from which we get the term Lucifer. This is actually not a character in the Bible. This is the Latin translation of a Hebrew word, which means morning star. But in the book of Enoch, which is not in the Bible, it's in the Apocrypha. This is a group of writings outside the Bible in some traditions. But Enoch implies that these are the same. Son of dawn, morning star, Satan, Lucifer, and they get sort of conflated throughout the Bible and throughout Christian tradition. And we begin to think of sort of the evil one, Satan, the dragon, the serpent, the morning star, all as sort of the same thing. Lucifer, you may have heard, is thought to be a fallen angel once this sort of becomes personified. But whatever this all means, all of this different imagery and language, whatever Lucifer is, it comes to represent a character who has elevated himself above God. And this is understood to be the ultimate act of pride, the ultimate me monster. The character of Lucifer, Satan, the devil, they personify a desire to be greater than God, to elevate the self above God, which means, if you think about it, to elevate the self above all others, to make yourself more, to make yourself better, to make yourself higher than others. This is the serpent's promise in the garden. You can be like God. You'll know good and evil like God. You'll be the best. And so sort of what we might call the prophetic critique in this me monster story in the garden is the reminder of dust, right? You are not God. From dust you came, and to dust you will return. And maybe this is sort of the ultimate me monster antidote, right? Like, oh, really? You finished an Ironman? You hiked the Appalachian Trail? You made your first million at 22? You have a fleet of sports cars in Zurich? You walked on the moon? You are not God. Like, great. All of those things are great. And this is funny because this is like 3 4-letter words that feels, 4 3-letter words that feels like a 4-letter word to us. This is like very insulting. What? I'm not God. We're going to come back to this in a bit, but just a little teaser. What is the picture we get of ultimate reality, the image of God in the Christian tradition? Is it invincibility? Is it absolute power? Is it victory? Is it success? Not quite. Body broken. Bloodshed. Somehow this becomes sort of the image that we carry forward. Augustine's definition of pride is pretty dead on, I think also for defining a me monster, the love of one's own excellence. This is St. Augustine. And it's subtle though, but it's important. The issue is not excellence. It is the love of one's own excellence. It's almost like that passage about money being the root of all evil. The root of all kinds of evil is not money, it's the love of money. The issue is not the excellence, it's falling in love with your own excellence. And this is a story of Narcissus, right? He resists the temptation of the nymphs, he sees his own reflection in the pool, and he falls in love with it. He falls in love with his own excellence. A fixation with one's own self, one's physical appearance, one's public perception, however it is, which, let's be honest, narcissism has become normalized in our culture in a way that it never has been in human history. Can I get a witness? No. This, I would have accepted bingo, but this is, I think, connected with the individualism of our culture in the way that what individualism does is isolate us from each other. And this sort of goes back to last week's point. Narcissus becomes maybe a superficial reading of the deeper truth, which is it's really a deception for us to think that we can mirror ourselves, right? That we can look in a reflection and see ourselves. We are unable to hear our own inner wisdom. We actually require other people in order to best hear ourselves. In a good conversation, everyone gets heard. In a great conversation, people are empowered to hear themselves, right? By bouncing this off other people, by engaging in dialogue. And it seems from the garden to the prophets to Jesus, the countercultural path of the Bible is the path of dust or the path of humility. And it's not to knock you down, right? It's simply to remind you that even if you walk on the moon, right? And some people do, it happens. Even if you walk on the moon, you're still going to die. In fact, does anybody know what happened January 16th of this year? Anybody know? No? Probably not huge news. Gene Carnan, who was the last man who walked on the moon, he died at 82 years old. And we sort of go, but wait a minute, he walked on the moon. Yeah, he walked on the moon, and he died. And just a side note, how do you become the kind of person that walks on the moon? Carnan said in an interview, my dad used to always say, just go out and do your best. You're not going to be better than everyone at everything. And he says, my dad was right. How do you become the kind of person that walks on the moon? Humility. Don't be a me monster. Don't fall in love with your own excellence. Now, we need to be careful when we critique me monsters, when we dance around things like pride, because we also have to be honest, there truly are some things that are just more excellent than others. I will say, as someone who plays very often in the band, the music tonight is more excellent than many other nights. We've had some rough ones. The music tonight is spot on. I know this also because I taught biblical literature to college freshmen, and I had to read their papers. Some things are more excellent than others. Some are just bad. And I'd have these feedback sessions in the class, and there would be these recurring errors that many students in the class made, and I'd sort of write them up on the board, and I'd say, hey, you totally missed it on these ideas. And every once in a while, I would get the pushback from the students, like, who do you think you are, right, to say what's wrong or what's bad? Like, who made you the standard of excellence? And I'd have to go, well, let me explain. This is good scholarship. Here's what the best and most respected voices in the field consider the very best interpretation of what we're talking about. And here's yours, and it's wrong. and it's bad, and your writing is rubbish, and your argument is flimsy at best. So this is good and this is bad. This is excellent and this is just not. The point being, it's okay for us to admit that some things are excellent. Some things are more excellent. There's nothing wrong with identifying excellence in and of itself. I've been watching, anybody watch the Tour de France? Anybody bike race? I'm literally the only one. Cool. Angela does because of Peter. You don't just watch it on your own, I assume, right? It happens to be on in the background. Yeah. So in the tour, I've been watching, and I get sort of little snippets, 20 or 30 minutes if I'm lucky. The tour holds this amazing paradox, right? Because everyone who lines up to ride is excellent. You don't get to put on the jersey and get on the bike if you are not the best in the world. And at the same time, every day for a month, they spend the day deciding who is the most excellent. Stage winners, climbers, young riders, sprinters. There was this epic photo finish just a few days ago. Look at that. Yeah. And I think they've run they've ridden I think over 120 miles by the time they get to this sprint, and that's how it ends. That's a great question. I couldn't have queued that up any better than I did. That guy. Tragically, this is the best. I watched this interview, and it was so hard to watch. The guy who thought he won, he booked it to the winner's circle. He's doing interviews. He's celebrating. And the reporter has to go, oh, yeah, no, sorry. It was the other guy who won. Today, the other guy was more excellent by a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a second. We're probably talking millimeters once they actually got to diagnosing the video. The issue is not identifying excellence. The issue is falling in love with your own excellence. The me monster is driven by the notion of being number one, being the most excellent, having to be the best, and falls in love with the inflated sense of self. And again, notice, we're saying an inflated sense of self, not a healthy sense of self. It's not the excellence, it's the falling in love. It's not the me, it's the monster. That's the problem. For Aristotle, pride is actually a virtue. Right? Healthy self-esteem. He calls it self-assurance, and he says this is okay to have an appropriate self-evaluation. And we use this regularly, right? I'm proud of the work I do. When I work really hard, I'm proud of it. This is different than falling in love with it. To say that I like myself is different than self-obsession. Healthy self-esteem, self-respect is a part of a healthy spirituality, a healthy self-development. When Huck gives me this Father's Day gift, Daddy, you're as smart as Iron Man, strong as the Hulk, fast as Superman, brave as Batman. You're my favorite superhero. Now, I know my son can't write. So when I get this, do I rip it to shreds and say, this looks nothing like Iron Man? Hulk would be at least twice the size. Did your teachers write this for you? Really? You're not even going to write it on your own? No excuses. Play like a champion. If you're going to make me art, make it right. There is a place for standards of excellence and for critique, but there is also a place to instill healthy self-esteem, to instill unconditional positive regard. There is a difference between humility and humiliation. And humility is back to that sense of accurate self-assessment. Maybe we could say it like this: you need to develop an ego before you can let go of it. You have to have an ego before you can set it aside. Jesus says, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. You have to have a self before you can deny it. You can't begin by pretending the self doesn't exist. You have to have a healthy self so that you can be healthy enough to decide to lay it aside. And he says stuff that challenges in the most direct way the culture of the me monster, this culture of narcissism, the culture of egomaniacal self-importance, and the love affair we have with our own excellence. The first will be last. The first will be last. How many of you have heard this before? Right. Keep your hands up. How many of you don't believe this? Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up, I said. Let's be honest, we don't believe this. It doesn't make any sense, right? First of all, this is nonsense because we live in a world where the last will be last. Like, Jesus, are you not a good American? What is this? No. The first win and the last lose, period. That's the world we live in. Second place is the first loser, period. The first gets the yellow jersey, last goes home with nothing. The first will be last? Our orientation around this self-obsession with being the first and the best and the top and the winner, this manifests interpersonally as the me monster. If I am anyone, I must be number one. If I am in a conversation, the only spot for me in the conversation is the top, right? Otherwise, I'm losing. And often, I think, maybe more than often, 99.9% of the time, we mean this comparatively, right? When we get into these conversations and we one up and we become the me monster, it's not, what I'm not saying is I've achieved the most I can. I'm the best I can be. I've realized and actualized the pinnacle of my personal potential. What we mean is, comparatively, I'm better than you. I'm not talking about how well I've done for myself with what I'm capable of doing based on my potential. In a conversation, what we mean is, comparatively, me, you, I'm better than you. I was listening to this podcast, and they were talking about self-centeredness, selfishness, selflessness, and it told the story of this guy whose dad wrote a book, and his friend asked him, he goes, man, your dad just wrote this best-selling book. He's getting all these accolades, and he's on a speaking tour, and everybody wants to talk to him now. This is amazing. What do you think of your dad's book? And his friend goes, I just keep thinking to myself, what does this mean for me? No. What do you think about your dad's book? No, I just keep thinking, what does this mean for me? Often, when it comes to unchecked pride and ego, the engine of the me monster, and people said this in the conversation, often it's not because of a strong ego, it's because of a weak ego. And elevating yourself in order to draw others to yourself, and it backfires in this way. You elevate yourself in order to draw others because of your own insecurity, because of the desire to be liked, but it ends up having the opposite effect. You end up pushing people away from you. And this shows up as vanity, which means emptiness or untruthfulness. The idea with vanity is simply that I want to appear better than you. And not that I actually am better than you, but I'm happy if I just appear better than you, right? I don't need to have any better character or anything as long as I appear better than you are. And I had this coach early on in Ironman training who told me, he said, you're going to go to this first race. I want you not to look at the bikes of any of the other racers. Don't bother. It means nothing. And what he knew that I didn't know was that you show up in the transition area for an Ironman event, and this is like 700 or 1,000 bikes. One of the events I did was like 2,000 people. And among 2,000 bikes, so many of these are like $5,000 to $10,000 bikes, right? More than a lot of people spend on a car. A huge chunk of them are like $15,000 to $20,000 triathlon bikes. And he would always say this to me: a Lamborghini body with an MG motor always loses to an MG body with a Lamborghini motor, right? You've built the motor, you race your race. And what he's saying is being in shape on a crappy bike always wins over being out of shape on a really expensive bike, right? A nice bike can't win a race. And many of these guys, they had the money to get the top of the line gear to appear better. Not that they were, but they could afford to appear that way. And it was sweet, sweet satisfaction to pass these guys on $15,000 bikes on my beater road bike with plastic bars and a broken frame. That's probably one of my Me Monster stories. I know you weren't asking, but I needed to tell it. Ultimately, this all connects back to the philosophical question, who am I, right? Identity, who am I? And this is the danger, though. From the perspective of the Me Monster, and they don't see this shift. They don't feel this happening. We don't. From the perspective of the Me Monster, this question is always reframed like this: who am I becomes how am I seen by others? Who am I becomes how am I seen by others? What other people think of me defines who I am. And this is not the minority of people. I think most of us battle this, probably on a daily basis. Who am I really versus who do I want other people to think I am? We know what this feels like. And again, I'm a 3 on the Enneagram. Managing perception is my basest addiction. This is my deepest insecurity as well. People-pleasing is my gateway drug. All right? If I can get people to think a certain way about me, then I'm happy. But what I'm learning is that very often, by the time I realize how miserable I am or how much I don't like who I've become or what I'm doing, I am miles down the road of managing other people's perception. And I have not yet stopped to ask the question, what do I think? What do I feel about that? What do I need in this situation? I haven't stopped to ask that initial question, which is, who am I? And I've spent all of my energy and all of my time answering the second question, which is, what do people think about me? What do I need to do to manage that and totally lose myself in it? The author of the book of Philippians says this: in your relationship with one another, have the same attitude of mind that Christ Jesus had, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. This little gem of a passage is a springboard for countless theological debates, which we don't have time for tonight. But this is, in my opinion, the origin point of radical theology, the idea of a self-emptying God. Jesus, who being in very nature God, and I just want to put a parenthesis here, with every reason to be the ultimate Me Monster, right? I walked on the moon. I'm God. You can't get much better than that. But here's the thing. Don't get hung up. Please, don't get hung up on whether or not you believe this and miss the point. Look at what the passage is saying. Being in very nature God, he did not use it to his own advantage. Having walked on the moon, he kept his mouth shut. Right? Having walked on the moon. What Jerry said, having walked on the moon, he acted impressed with people who could walk down the street. He made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. The Greek word is doula, right? Like a midwife will have a doula, an assistant, a helper. And being found a human, he humbled himself, became obedient to death on the cross. And we sort of have to pause and go, hold on. It's a bit of whiplash here, right? Because for most of the Christian tradition, what we do is celebrate Jesus is God. Jesus is the best. Jesus is the highest. Jesus has all the power. Jesus, right? But then we get here and we go, wait a minute. Absolute humility is the picture of God. This is the Christ. This is the Messiah, the Lord, the King. Me monster of all me monsters, master of the universe? No. Servant. Helper. self-emptying. And regardless of what you believe about Jesus or God, how literally you want to take the passage or how literally you want to read it as metaphor or symbol, what is the story that's being communicated? With all power and all authority, the full resources of the universe at its disposal with nearly hyperbolic excellence, the most that we can imagine, imagined in the name God, all ability, all opportunity to one up and put down, to push others under, to lord over, better than everyone, better than anyone who has ever been. What happens in the story in the name of God? Denying the privilege and nature of being God. Setting it aside. Denying the nature and the privilege of being on top in order to serve. Humbling oneself to live on the bottom in solidarity with people who live on the bottom. We said the king of Babylon represented what's called an ascending spirituality. This would be the opposite. This is called a descending spirituality, a path of descent, or a descent theology. The Greek word is kenosis. To let go, to self-empty, self-giving. In the Buddhist tradition, this is called non-attachment. To be able to let the self go, to surrender the outcome. Now, here's the crazy thing, and this is not comedy, this is true, so it's tragedy. The passage opens, have the same attitude of mind as this Christ. How did the Christian tradition become a religion filled with such arrogance and such pride, and so often, so many insufferable me monsters? We're supposed to be following that example. We're supposed to be emulating that attitude, self-giving humility. Whatever you have, whatever you've done, however excellent you are, and you probably are pretty excellent, whatever story you can tell to trump any and every other story at every dinner party, set it aside. Lay it down. Discover the posture of serving others. What does it mean to be a servant in a conversation? I mean, starting in this room, that's why we practice, right? Conversations around tables are a part of our spiritual practice. That's not like a pause commercial break in a service. This is it. That's the work. What does it mean to serve the other voices around your table? What does humility feel like in a group of 4 or 5 people having a conversation? Humility, self-giving love, letting go, falling out of love with your own excellence in order to see and love the excellence in our fellows and our neighbors, even our enemies. This is the biblical path from the story of the garden to Isaiah to Jesus. You want to be like God? Well, just remember, you're dust. You will die. To the king of Babylon, right? You want to make yourself God. You want to live and rule and reign on high above God. And it's pretty dark, right? And it's kind of violent, but essentially Isaiah is saying, you will be brought low, right? It's not going to last. Jesus says this crazy stuff. Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. The last will be first, the greatest will be least, the first of all will be the servant of all. This is what's called the upside down kingdom. Francis prays this prayer, asking God to make him an instrument of peace, not to be understood, but to understand. We might say, not to be heard, but to hear. There is no peace until we can begin to set aside the me monster. And this humility, this invitation brings us always back to this table because of the stark difference between individual and communal. And this changes everything. The preference for everyone to have a voice, the desire to mellow the me monsters in our midst, this isn't just rejecting the idea that me monsters come off as assholes, right? Fine, we know that. But when conversations are dominated by a single voice, we lose the supreme value of revelation through conversation. This is where we ended last week, right? The technology of revelation, of wisdom, of the call of the Spirit has evolved. It is no longer a single voice from whom we await the singular, clear, objective truth delivered. we now live as the body of Christ, which means the voice, the Spirit, the wisdom of Christ arrive as the symphony of our voices and our stories and our experiences, and the voice can only be heard when we learn to share in humility. When we me-monster and dominate conversations and love with our own excellence, when we hog the spotlight at the expense of the other voices at our table, we're not just being rude. We are silencing the voice of God in and as our community. This is where we hear God, the people around you, in these conversations. That's where enlightenment comes from. That's where wisdom comes from. That's where we hear that call. And so when we break this bread, and when we share this cup, these symbols of body broken, of blood shed, we reenact this path of descent, the kenotic, self-giving, humble love that we see in Christ, who being in very nature God, did not use it to his own advantage, but he humbles himself to the point of death, body separated from blood. We might say, who having walked on the moon, humbled himself to elevate the voices of everyone else, the people around him, those he loved. We remind ourselves of this supreme humility. We invite ourselves again to fall out of love with our own excellence, to set aside our own power in order to fall in love again with the excellence of the people around us, to empower the people around us. And then we consume this symbol of Christ's singular body into our corporate body. Everybody gets a piece. And we remind ourselves that we are now the body of Christ. We are now the one in and whom through the voice of God is heard. And the voice of Christ is now heard only through the communal voice of this body in the world. And so this table, which both reminds us of this humility and inspires us to practice it in listening for the call of God in our own humble conversations, this table is set for us tonight. As always, it is open to us. It is open to all people. And no one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.